Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we're traveling across 1,000 years of quiet power to a time before England had a crown, before kings ruled by law, and before a nation learned how to survive its own ambition. In this episode, you'll drift through the rise and fall of royal dynasties, from scattered Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and Viking shadows, through conquest, civil war, silent revolutions, and finally to a crown that endured not by force, but by learning when to let go. This is the complete history of the English monarchy, not told through battles and noise, but through calm reflection, slow change, and the long rhythm of time itself. So before you get comfortable, take a gentle moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if these deep sleep history stories help you find peace, sleep better, or simply reflect on our shared journey through time. Now, close your eyes, let the noise of the day fade away, and allow history to speak softly as England begins, before it even knew its own name. Before England ever wore a crown, before the word itself carried weight or meaning, this land was something quieter, rougher, and far less certain. It was not a nation, not even an idea, but a scattering of fields, rivers, forests, and coastlines where survival mattered more than legacy. In those early centuries, no king dreamed of ruling England because England did not yet exist. There were only peoples, seasons, and the constant awareness that winter always returned, and that the sea could bring both trade and terror. Across this land, power was local, fragile, and deeply personal, held by rulers whose authority stretched only as far as a horse could ride in a day. This was the age historians would later call the Anglo-Saxon period, but to those living within it, it was simply life, unfolding slowly, year after year. The land was divided into what would later be remembered as the Heptarchy, 7 shifting kingdoms whose borders were never as firm as maps would suggest. Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, East Anglia, Kent, Essex, and Sussex rose and fell in importance like tides, each shaped by geography, ambition, and chance. These were not grand empires, but working kingdoms, rooted in farmland, bound by kinship, and defended by loyalty rather than walls of stone. Power here did not flow downward from distant palaces. It was negotiated daily through alliances, marriages, feasts, and oaths spoken by firelight. A king's strength was measured not by crowns or jewels, but by how many men would stand beside him when danger arrived. The rhythm of life was slow and repetitive, governed by harvests, livestock, and the narrow window of daylight that winter allowed. Villages slept early, rose early, and lived close to the earth. Their stories passed not through books, but through voices, carried across generations like a low, steady hum. Religion, too, was still finding its shape, blending old pagan beliefs with the spreading influence of Christianity, creating a spiritual landscape as layered and unsettled as the political one. In this world, history did not move in straight lines. It drifted, paused, and circled back on itself, shaped less by sudden change than by gradual adaptation. And just beyond the horizon, always present in the collective imagination, was the sea. It was both a boundary and a pathway, a source of sustenance and a reminder that the world did not end at the shore. Long before Viking sails became a familiar fear, the sea had already taught these early kingdoms humility. It reminded them that they were small, that their land was open, and that nothing they built was truly permanent. In this quiet, unsettled world, before crowns and coronations, the foundations of England were being laid not through conquest or proclamation, but through endurance. The people of these early kingdoms were not preparing to build a nation. They were simply learning how to last. And in that slow persistence, in that unremarkable continuity of life, the earliest shape of England was beginning to form, unnoticed and unnamed, waiting for history to give it a crown. In a world where kings were often remembered for how loudly they conquered, Alfred of Wessex would be remembered for something quieter. He did not inherit a peaceful kingdom, nor did he rule during an age of stability. Instead, Alfred came to power when the land itself seemed exhausted, when the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were thinning under pressure, and when the Viking presence had shifted from distant threat to constant reality. Raids were no longer sudden interruptions, but recurring seasons of fear, arriving as predictably as winter winds. Villages burned, monasteries fell silent, and the idea of permanence became fragile. Many rulers before Alfred had tried to meet this pressure with force alone, charging forward in moments of crisis, hoping that bravery could replace preparation. Alfred learned, slowly and painfully, that survival required something different. Early in his reign, defeat was not an exception, but a lesson repeated. There were moments when Wessex itself seemed on the verge of disappearance, when Alfred was forced into hiding, reduced from king to fugitive, listening rather than commanding. Yet it was in these quiet intervals, far from the formalities of power, that Alfred's legacy began to take shape. He observed the rhythms of his enemies, the patterns of their movements, and the reasons they succeeded where others failed. The Vikings were not unstoppable because they were stronger, they were effective because they were adaptable. Alfred responded not with spectacle, but with patience. He reorganized defenses, built fortified towns known as burhs, and transformed scattered resistance into a network of mutual protection. War, under Alfred, became less about heroic clashes and more about endurance. But Alfred's vision extended beyond survival. He understood that a kingdom could not be held together by walls alone. Knowledge, memory, and shared identity mattered just as deeply. In a time when learning had retreated into the shadows, Alfred promoted education, translation, and the preservation of texts, believing that a people who remembered who they were could withstand pressure longer than those who relied solely on force. This commitment to learning was not a luxury, it was strategy. By strengthening language, law, and faith, Alfred gave his people something internal to defend, something that could not be burned or carried away by ships. His reign did not bring instant peace, nor did it erase the Viking presence. Instead, it introduced a steadier rhythm, one where setbacks did not mean collapse and where time itself became an ally. Alfred ruled with an understanding that power did not need to shout to endure. It could wait, adapt, and persist quietly. In later centuries, he would be called the Great, a title rarely given lightly. But during his lifetime, Alfred was simply a king learning how to last in a world that tested every certainty. He did not create England, but he shaped the conditions under which England could eventually exist. Through restraint, preparation, and a rare respect for continuity, Alfred transformed a fragile kingdom into something resilient, and in doing so, he offered a different model of kingship, one that valued patience over spectacle and survival over glory. For the early kingdoms of England, the Vikings were not always experienced as a single moment of catastrophe, but as something far more unsettling, a presence that returned again and again, like a dream that never fully faded. They arrived from the sea not only with fire and iron, but with uncertainty, dissolving the fragile sense of rhythm that Anglo-Saxon life depended upon. At first, they were distant figures, rumored shapes beyond the horizon, their long ships spoken of in hushed voices rather than witnessed. But over time, those rumors became familiar patterns, and familiarity did not bring comfort, it brought anticipation. Coastal communities learned to read the water differently, to notice changes in the wind, to sense when the sea felt too quiet. The Vikings did not simply invade land, they unsettled time itself. Raids did not follow seasons of war and peace. They interrupted prayer, harvest, and sleep. A monastery might stand untouched for decades, only to vanish in a single morning, leaving behind silence where routine once lived. This unpredictability seeped into the collective memory, shaping how people thought about safety, faith, and permanence. Yet, as much as the Vikings represented danger, they also reflected something deeper about the world England was slowly entering. They were not an anomaly, but a reminder that isolation was no longer possible. The sea that once marked the edge of the known world had become a corridor. Through it flowed not only violence, but trade, ideas, and eventual settlement. Over generations, the line between invader and neighbor blurred. Some Vikings stayed. They farmed, married, and spoke new languages. Their presence altered law, custom, and identity in ways that were gradual rather than dramatic. What made the Viking Age so exhausting was not its intensity, but its duration. It did not resolve quickly. It lingered, teaching the early English kingdoms a lesson in endurance. Fear became routine, and routine reshaped resilience. Over time, the sound of oars cutting water became part of the mental landscape, a background rhythm that life adjusted around. This constant pressure forced change. Kings like Alfred learned that the answer was not to eliminate the threat entirely, but to adapt to a world where threats returned. Fortifications rose, systems formed, and memory sharpened. The Vikings, once a nightmare, became a factor, something accounted for rather than endlessly feared. And in that quiet shift, something important happened. England began to think of itself not as a series of isolated places, but as a connected space that needed coordination, patience, and shared awareness. The Viking Age did not end with a single victory or defeat. It faded slowly, like a dream dissolving at dawn, leaving traces behind. Words, place names, customs, and bloodlines carried its memory forward. By the time the sea grew quieter, the land had changed. The people had changed. What remained was not relief, but experience. The early kingdoms had learned how to live with uncertainty, how to sleep despite knowing the horizon was never entirely safe. And that knowledge, born from repetition rather than revelation, became one of the quiet foundations of England itself. The year 1066 did not arrive with thunder. It did not announce itself as a turning point, nor did the people living through it understand that they were standing at the edge of a different England. Like most years before it, 1066 unfolded quietly at first, shaped by familiar rhythms of labor, prayer, and expectation. Yet beneath that surface calm, the balance that had held the island together since the time of the Anglo-Saxon kings was already loosening. Power was still personal, loyalty still local, and kingship still bound to land rather than institution. But the world beyond the Channel had changed, and England was no longer distant enough to remain untouched. When William of Normandy crossed the sea, he did not bring a new king alone. He brought a different understanding of power. His claim to the English throne was framed not only by blood and promise, but by certainty. William did not see England as a collection of kingdoms or customs to be negotiated with patience. He saw it as something to be possessed, structured, and reorganized. The Battle of Hastings, often remembered as a single violent moment, was in truth only the opening breath of a much longer transformation. What followed was not chaos, but compression. Authority tightened. Land was measured, recorded, and reassigned. Where Anglo-Saxon rule had grown organically through networks of loyalty, Norman rule arrived with intention. Castles rose where halls once stood, not merely as defenses, but as symbols. They were visible reminders that power had moved upward and inward, away from communal agreement and towards centralized command. William ruled as a conqueror, but also as an architect. He understood that lasting control required more than victory. It required permanence. Stone replaced wood. Written records replaced spoken memory. The Doomsday Book did not simply count land and livestock, it counted obedience. Through it, England became legible to authority in a way it never had been before. Language itself began to shift. Norman French entered the halls of power, reshaping law, governments, and identity. English did not disappear, but it retreated, absorbing, adapting, waiting. This quiet linguistic layering mirrored the deeper transformation taking place. England was learning to breathe differently. The old rhythms did not vanish overnight, but they were interrupted, redirected, and slowly overwritten. What made 1066 endure in memory was not only the conquest, but the clarity that followed it. Power now had a center. Kingship was no longer a fragile agreement balanced between rivals, but an institution with reach, weight, and continuity. William did not create peace, but he created structure. And structure, once established, has a way of outlasting the men who build it. In this sense, 1066 was not simply a year of change. It was the moment England began to recognize authority as something external and enduring, something that stood above individual rulers. The land did not yet know it, but a monarchy was being born, not from tradition, but from design. And once designed, it would not easily be undone. After the initial shock of conquest faded, England did not descend into endless chaos. Instead, something quieter and more enduring took place. Power began to settle into the land, not as noise, but as weight. The Normans understood something their predecessors rarely had the means to enforce. Authority must be seen to be believed. Across the countryside, the landscape itself began to change. Where timber halls once blended into fields and forests, stone structures now rose with deliberate permanence. Castles were not simply military tools, they were psychological ones. Their towers interrupted familiar horizons, reminding villagers each morning that power was no longer distant or negotiable. It was present, immovable, and watching. These structures altered how people moved, gathered, and even slept. The land learned new boundaries, drawn not by tradition, but by command. Alongside stone came language, and with it, a subtle reshaping of thought. Norman French flowed into the courts, the law, and the rituals of governance. Words for authority, justice, and hierarchy shifted, creating a linguistic divide that mirrored the social one. English remained the language of the fields and hearths, while French became the language of rule. Over time, these layers blended, but in the early years, the separation was clear. Power spoke differently now. It sounded foreign, refined, and distant. Yet this distance was intentional. By separating rulers from ruled through language and ceremony, the Normans reinforced the idea that authority stood above everyday life. This was a new experience for England. Under Anglo-Saxon kings, power had often felt personal, accessible, and bound to local custom. Under Norman rule, it became abstract, systematic, and enduring. Law was written, recorded, and standardized. Land ownership was defined with precision, leaving little room for ambiguity. The Doomsday Survey transformed memory into measurement, replacing oral tradition with documented fact. This shift was not dramatic in daily life, but it was profound. People began to understand their place not only through relationships, but through records they would never see. Over time, this created a quiet discipline. Resistance did not disappear, but it became less spontaneous, more calculated. The Normans did not rely solely on force, they relied on predictability. When authority behaves consistently, even harshly, it teaches compliance through expectation. England adjusted. Life continued beneath the towers, around the courts, and within the new framework of rule. Children grew up knowing castles as part of the natural world, their presence unquestioned. Language blended slowly, softening edges while preserving hierarchy. The Conquest's true power lay not in its violence, but in its patience. It reshaped habits, assumptions, and rhythms until the new order felt inevitable. By making authority visible and language deliberate, the Normans transformed England into a place where power could survive individual rulers. Kings would come and go, but the structure they ruled through would remain. And in that structure, the earliest form of a true monarchy took root, not as a symbol alone, but as a lived reality that touched every corner of the land. As the Norman presence settled into England, something subtle but irreversible took place. Kingship began to detach itself from the personality of the king. Under the Anglo-Saxon world, rule had often depended on presence, persuasion, and personal bonds. A king was known, spoken to, and judged in close proximity. But after 1066, authority began to operate at a distance. William the Conqueror did not need to be everywhere to rule everywhere. The systems he established carried his will long after he moved on. Sheriffs, courts, written law, and fortified centers acted on his behalf, creating a web of governance that no single village could escape. This shift changed how power felt. It became less negotiable and more inevitable. Even when resistance stirred, it faced not a man, but a structure. The crown no longer asked for loyalty, it assumed it. Over time, this assumption reshaped expectations. Children were born into a world where the king's authority was already present, already enforced, already recorded. There was no memory of choosing a ruler, only of living beneath one. This continuity was new. It created a sense of permanence that outlasted fear. While early Norman rule had been harsh, its consistency brought a strange calm. People adapted to predictability, even when it limited them. Taxes arrived when expected. Justice followed defined procedures. Land belonged to those recorded as owners. Life narrowed, but it also stabilized. Through this narrowing, England learned to function as a single governed space rather than a collection of overlapping loyalties. The monarchy, once fragile and personal, became an institution. It no longer depended on charisma or immediate success in battle. It depended on inheritance, documentation, and recognition beyond any one ruler's lifetime. William's successors inherited not just a crown, but a system that demanded obedience by default. This was the true birth of royal power in England, not the moment of conquest, but the moment authority became routine. Once power becomes routine, it becomes invisible. It fades into the background of daily life, shaping decisions without announcing itself. People plan around it, sleep beneath it, and eventually forget a time without it. By the end of the Norman transformation, England had crossed a threshold. It was no longer simply ruled, it was organized. The crown no longer needed to prove itself each generation. It endured. In endurance, more than strength or glory, is what defines monarchy. In this quiet shift, the foundations were laid for centuries of royal dynasties to come. The future kings of England would argue, fight, reform, and fall, but they would do so within a framework that no longer questioned the crown's right to exist. That certainty began here, in the slow aftermath of 1066, when power learned how to remain. There are dynasties that fall to invasion, and there are dynasties that bend slowly under the weight of their own authority. The Plantagenet era belonged to the second kind. By the time the Plantagenets ruled England, the monarchy was no longer fragile. It was established, structured, and deeply embedded in the land. And yet that strength carried its own burden. Power no longer needed to be seized, it needed to be managed, maintained, and justified. This was a quieter struggle, one that unfolded not in sudden collapse, but in prolonged tension. Henry II inherited not only a crown, but an expectation that the crown could reach everywhere at once. His reign stretched across England and deep into France, creating a realm so wide that distance itself became an enemy. To govern such a space required constant movement, endless decisions, and unrelenting attention. Authority traveled with the king, but it was never fully present everywhere. This absence bred pressure. Nobles watched closely, measuring the limits of royal reach, while the king worked tirelessly to tighten control through law rather than force. Henry's vision was not of endless war, but of order. He believed that a system of justice could bind a kingdom more effectively than armies. Courts expanded, procedures standardized, and the idea of royal law began to replace local custom. This ambition, however, carried tension. Justice centralized is justice questioned. As the crown extended its influence into daily life, resistance took new forms. The struggle was no longer simply between armies, but between expectations. The king expected obedience, the nobility expected tradition. Between them lay exhaustion. Even within Henry's own household, strain grew. Power weighed heavily on family as well as land. Succession, loyalty, and ambition collided, turning private relationships into political fault lines. The crown did not rest, and neither did those who lived beneath it. When Richard the Lionheart followed, the nature of strain shifted but did not ease. Richard embodied the outward image of kingship, bold, martial, and restless. Yet his reign revealed another dimension of the crown's weight: absence. Richard spent little time in England. His authority felt more through taxation than presence. The crown demanded resources to sustain distant wars, and England paid steadily. Coins moved outward, pressure moved inward. The people learned that royal power could be felt even when the king himself was far away. This distance created a quiet resentment, not explosive but persistent. The Plantagenet monarchy continued, not through harmony but through endurance. Each reign layered strain upon strain as expectations grew faster than capacity. The crown became a symbol not only of authority but of obligation. Kings were expected to protect, to judge, to fight, and to finance all at once. Failure in any one role echoed across the realm. This constant tension did not break the monarchy, but it reshaped it. Power was no longer imagined as effortless. It was labor. It demanded sacrifice, vigilance, and compromise. The Plantagenet era teaches that strength does not guarantee peace. Often it guarantees responsibility. And responsibility, carried over generations, becomes fatigue. This fatigue would not end the dynasty, but it would leave marks deep enough to shape everything that followed. The crown endured, but it did so heavily, pressing down on those who wore it, reminding England that the greatest threat to a powerful monarchy is not invasion, but the slow weight of its own reach. As the Plantagenet crown grew heavier, the pressure it placed upon the land could no longer move in only one direction. Power had expanded steadily outward, but now it met resistance, not in open rebellion, but in insistence. Magna Carta emerged not as a sudden revolution, but as a necessary pause, a moment when authority was asked, gently but firmly, to listen. The barons who gathered did not seek to overthrow the king or dismantle the monarchy. They sought relief from exhaustion. Years of war, taxation, and uncertainty had stretched patience thin, and the crown's demands no longer felt reciprocal. Kings had claimed loyalty, resources, and obedience, yet offered little predictability in return. Magna Carta, often remembered for its symbolism, was rooted in practicality. It addressed grievances born from repetition rather than outrage. Arbitrary justice, endless levies, and unchecked authority had made daily life unstable even for the powerful. The document's language reflected this weariness. It did not speak in the tones of triumph, but of balance. It asked for limits, not endings. By placing constraints on royal power, it acknowledged something new, that authority could be bound without being broken. This was a profound shift. Until this moment, the crown had been assumed to stand above negotiation once established. Magna Carta suggested otherwise. It implied that endurance required consent, even if that consent was reluctant and uneven. The king remained king, but the role now carried obligations that could be named and remembered. Over time, this idea settled quietly into the political imagination. It did not immediately transform governance, nor did it bring peace, but it altered expectation. Power could be challenged without collapse. Law could stand beside the crown rather than beneath it. For a monarchy burdened by its own reach, this was not weakness, it was adaptation. The Plantagenet rulers continued to rule, but now with the knowledge that authority had edges. These edges did not stop conflict, but they reshaped it. Struggle moved from battlefield to parchment, from force to procedure. This transition was slow and incomplete, yet it marked a turning inward. The crown learned that survival depended not only on command, but on restraint. In this sense, Magna Carta functioned like a breath held and then released. It did not end tension, but it allowed it to circulate rather than suffocate. Over generations, its principles echoed, resurfacing whenever power grew too rigid. The document itself aged, but the pause it introduced endured. It taught England that fatigue could produce wisdom, and that limits could preserve rather than diminish authority. In the long reign of struggle, Magna Carta stands not as a victory or defeat, but as a moment of recognition. The crown was heavy, and to carry it forward, it would need moments of rest. As the Plantagenet centuries unfolded, the monarchy learned a difficult truth. Power does not rest simply because it endures. The crown survived conquest, reform, and resistance, but survival brought with it a relentless demand for motion. Wars did not arrive as isolated crises. They became a recurring condition of rule. Campaigns across the Channel, disputes over inheritance, and the defense of contested borders required constant funding, constant preparation, and constant justification. To sustain this momentum, the crown turned inward, drawing resources from the land with increasing regularity. Taxation, once exceptional, became expected. Each levy carried not only financial weight, but emotional strain. The people beneath the crown learned that stability came at a price paid repeatedly, not once. Over time, this repetition shaped perception. Royal authority began to feel less like protection and more like obligation. The Plantagenet kings did not lose control overnight. Instead, control thinned gradually, stretched across too many fronts. Every war demanded loyalty, yet each demand made loyalty harder to sustain. The crown's voice remained firm, but its reach felt heavier. Nobles negotiated, towns resisted quietly, and the countryside absorbed pressure through endurance rather than enthusiasm. The monarchy remained powerful, but it no longer felt distant and untouchable. It felt present everywhere, and presence can exhaust. This exhaustion seeped into governance. Decisions became reactive rather than visionary. Short-term necessity overshadowed long-term trust. The crown's legitimacy was no longer questioned in principle, but it was tested in practice. Could authority continue to ask without giving? Could endurance replace consent indefinitely? These questions did not erupt into immediate collapse, but they lingered, shaping the political atmosphere like a low, constant pressure. By the end of the Plantagenet era, the monarchy still stood, but it stood on tired ground. The crown had carried England through transformation, yet it had also accumulated strain that could not be ignored. What followed would not be a simple continuation, but a reckoning. The lessons of this long struggle would echo forward, influencing how future dynasties ruled, resisted, and redefined power. The Plantagenets did not fail because they were weak. They endured long enough to reveal the cost of endurance itself. And as the crown passed onward, it carried with it not only authority, but fatigue, a quiet inheritance that would shape the centuries to come.
Sometimes, a kingdom does not fall because it is invaded. Sometimes it collapses because it grows tired of itself. By the middle of the 15th century, England had reached such a moment. The long strain of Plantagenet rule had left the land weary, its institutions intact but hollowed by repetition and unresolved tension. Authority still existed, but confidence had thinned. The crown remained, yet its weight no longer felt purposeful. It pressed downward without direction. Into this quiet exhaustion came a conflict that would later be remembered as the Wars of the Roses, though to those living through it, it felt less like a war and more like a slow unraveling. The struggle between the House of York and the House of Lancaster was not born from sudden ambition. It emerged from accumulated fatigue, from questions left unanswered for generations. Both houses traced their legitimacy to the same royal bloodline, and therein lay the problem. When authority is shared too evenly, it begins to fracture. Loyalty becomes conditional. Allegiance shifts with circumstance rather than conviction. England did not divide cleanly. Families found themselves split, regions uncertain, and identities blurred. The conflict moved in waves, rising and receding without resolution. Battles came and went, but none brought lasting clarity. Kings were crowned and uncrowned with unsettling regularity. Power changed hands, yet nothing truly changed. What defined this period was not constant violence, but constant instability. The land learned to live with uncertainty as a background condition. Governance faltered, not because structures collapsed, but because trust dissolved. Law remained, yet enforcement depended on who held the crown that year. Justice became provisional. The people adapted by lowering expectations. Survival replaced loyalty. Silence replaced celebration. The roses that symbolized the rival houses bled quietly into the soil, staining not only battlefields but memory itself. Over time, the conflict drained England's capacity for renewal. Resources were consumed internally rather than directed outward. The crown's authority weakened not through defeat, but through repetition. Each claim to legitimacy sounded familiar, yet less convincing. The monarchy no longer represented continuity, it represented interruption. This inward struggle reshaped the nation's emotional landscape. Fear became cautious routine. Hope narrowed. What remained was endurance without direction. By the later stages of the conflict, the question was no longer which house would prevail, but whether the kingdom could sustain another cycle of division. The Wars of the Roses did not destroy England, they exhausted it. And exhaustion creates openings. As the great houses weakened themselves, space emerged for something new. The soil, worn and bloodied, was being prepared not by design, but by attrition. England was not ready for peace yet, but it was ready for change. And in that readiness, unseen at first, the path toward a different dynasty began to take shape.
The struggle between York and Lancaster did not move toward a destination. It moved in circles. Each victory felt temporary, each defeat reversible, and this uncertainty became the defining rhythm of the age. Kings rose and fell with unsettling ease. Their authority accepted one season and questioned the next. What made the conflict so draining was not its scale, but its repetition. England lived inside a loop of anticipation and disappointment. Allegiance shifted quietly, often without ceremony, as survival replaced conviction. Nobles learned to wait, to watch, and to choose sides only when necessity forced their hand. The crown, once a symbol of continuity, became a sign of interruption. Governance slowed. Decisions hesitated. The future narrowed to short intervals between battles. In this environment, power lost its voice. It no longer declared direction, it reacted. The land adjusted to instability as if it were weather, something endured rather than solved. Markets opened cautiously. Farms worked the soil without certainty of who would claim the harvest. Families learned to speak softly about loyalty, knowing that today's truth might become tomorrow's liability. The war did not ask the people to participate, it demanded that they endure. Over time, this endurance reshaped the nation's inner life. Trust became selective, memory shortened. The past no longer offered guidance because it repeated itself without resolution. Even the symbols of the rival houses began to blur. The white rose and the red rose lost their sharp meaning, becoming marks of habit rather than belief. What remained was fatigue. This fatigue hollowed authority from within. Each claimant to the throne promised restoration, yet delivered only continuation. The monarchy survived, but its presence felt thin, stretched across competing claims. England was not breaking apart, it was wearing down. The longer the conflict lasted, the less it resembled a struggle for legitimacy, and the more it resembled a test of endurance. Victory no longer meant triumph, it meant relief, brief and uncertain. In this slow erosion, the kingdom learned a quiet lesson. Power that cannot settle cannot sustain itself. The Wars of the Roses did not end because one side finally proved superior. They ended because the land could no longer support the cycle. Exhaustion closed possibilities that ambition had opened, and in that closing, something unexpected became possible. When conflict loses its meaning, space opens for resolution not through dominance, but through replacement. The war's greatest legacy was not a winner, but of vacancy. England stood ready, not for another claim, but for a different kind of authority, one that promised not glory, but rest. When the Wars of the Roses finally loosened their grip on England, they did not end with a clear sense of victory. They ended the way long fatigue ends most struggles, not with celebration, but with silence. The land did not rejoice, it exhaled. After decades of shifting crowns and broken promises, the appetite for conflict had faded. England had not been conquered by a stronger force, it had been worn down by repetition. The great houses that once commanded loyalty now struggled to command attention. Their claims sounded familiar, their banners less inspiring. What the kingdom desired was not triumph, but stillness. Into this quiet came the rise of the Tudors, not as conquerors in the traditional sense, but as a solution shaped by exhaustion. Henry Tudor's claim was not the strongest by blood, nor the loudest by proclamation. It was accepted because it promised an end. After years of internal division, continuity mattered more than purity of lineage. The Battle of Bosworth, often remembered as the closing scene of the conflict, felt less like a climax and more like a release. It marked not the triumph of one house over another, but the collapse of a cycle that had lost its meaning. The Tudors inherited a kingdom eager to rest. Authority, under them, did not need to assert itself aggressively. The memory of chaos did that work already. Order became desirable. Stability felt generous. The crown regained weight, but this time it carried reassurance rather than anxiety. The long night of civil war had taught England what fragmentation cost. The Tudors offered coherence. They did not erase the past, they absorbed it, learning from the failures that had come before. This transition reshaped how monarchy was perceived. The crown was no longer simply a prize to be fought over, it became a symbol of recovery. The people adjusted their expectations accordingly. Loyalty returned slowly, cautiously, built on the hope that this reign would not demand constant vigilance. The roses had bled enough. England did not forget the wars, it folded them into memory, using them as a warning rather than a guide. In this sense, the Wars of the Roses did not end England's monarchy, they refined it. They stripped away illusions of effortless authority and replaced them with a desire for balance. The Tudors would rule with strength, but also with awareness of fragility. Their rise marked the beginning of a different relationship between crown and kingdom, one shaped by lessons learned the hard way. As the 15th century closed, England moved forward not with confidence, but with caution. And in that caution lay the possibility of renewal. The night had been long, the blood had been real. But morning arrived, quietly, not with fanfare, but with the simple promise that the kingdom could finally sleep.
Golden ages rarely arrive quietly. When the Tudor dynasty settled into England's consciousness, it did so with sound, movement, and spectacle. After decades of exhaustion and inward conflict, the kingdom found itself drawn toward energy once again. The crown no longer felt tentative. It felt certain, visible, and assertive. Henry VIII embodied this shift more fully than any ruler before him. He did not inherit a kingdom desperate for rest alone. He inherited one ready to be seen. The memory of civil war still lingered, but it no longer dictated caution. Instead, it sharpened ambition. Henry ruled not to recover stability, but to redefine authority itself. His reign announced that England was no longer content to be quiet. Yet beneath the pageantry and confidence lay danger. Power, once rested, had begun to speak loudly again.
Henry's court was filled with music, ceremony, and declaration, but it was also driven by anxiety. The crown demanded control not only of land and law, but of belief. Religion became the field upon which this demand played out most forcefully. Henry's break with Rome did not begin as a theological revolution. It began as a personal assertion of sovereignty. The desire to command succession transformed into a broader claim that no authority, spiritual or temporal, stood above the English crown. This assertion changed the texture of power. Faith, once shared across borders, became national. Loyalty shifted from distant institutions to the monarch himself. This consolidation brought clarity, but it also carried risk. When belief becomes bound to a ruler, dissent becomes treason. The kingdom adjusted quickly, outwardly compliant, inwardly uncertain. Tradition fractured, rituals changed, familiar structures dissolved and reformed under new names. The pace was relentless. Henry's authority did not allow pause. Decisions arrived fully formed and consequences followed without warning. This intensity energized England, but it also unsettled it. Stability existed, but it was conditional. The crown felt strong, yet brittle. Henry's reign revealed the volatility of confidence. The louder power speaks, the more it must be heard everywhere. England learned to move with the rhythm of royal will, celebrating its strength while fearing its reach. This tension defined the early Tudor experience. The nation stood taller, but also closer to the edge. The Golden Age was beginning, but it was already loud enough to disturb sleep. Beneath the triumph lay awareness. Greatness achieved through force requires constant motion, and motion, sustained too long, becomes a storm.
After the noise of Henry VIII, England entered a different kind of strength. Elizabeth I did not inherit a calm kingdom, but she understood that calm could be created. Where her father had spoken loudly, she listened. Where he had forced change through command, she guided it through presence. Elizabeth's power was not built on spectacle, but on balance. She ruled a nation shaped by religious fracture, economic uncertainty, and lingering fear of instability. Yet she chose patience as her primary instrument. This choice was not weakness, it was calculation. Elizabeth understood that authority, when overused, loses its effect. She cultivated ambiguity, allowing different factions to believe they were heard, even when decisions remained firmly in her hands. Religion, the great wound left by Henry's reign, was handled with care. Elizabeth did not demand uniformity of belief. She demanded loyalty to the crown. This distinction allowed England to breathe. Conflict did not disappear, but it softened. The kingdom learned to live with difference rather than be torn apart by it. Elizabeth's court reflected this measured approach. Ceremony remained, but it was tempered by accessibility. The Queen's presence became symbolic rather than oppressive. She was seen, but not overwhelming. Her authority flowed through diplomacy, image, and timing. Abroad, Elizabeth projected confidence without haste. She avoided unnecessary wars, choosing instead to let England's position grow through trade, navigation, and cultural influence. Power expanded quietly, without constant strain. The nation began to feel secure not because it was aggressive, but because it was coherent. This coherence fostered confidence. England's identity sharpened, shaped by language, exploration, and shared narrative.
Elizabeth became the center of this narrative, not as a conqueror, but as a stabilizing force. Her reign demonstrated that strength could be expressed through restraint. By not rushing to impose order, she allowed order to emerge organically. The crown regained trust not through fear, but through reliability. This trust did not eliminate danger. Elizabeth's position remained precarious, challenged by succession anxiety and external threats. Yet she navigated these pressures with steady rhythm. Decisions came at the right moment, not the loudest one. Over time, this rhythm settled into the national consciousness. England learned that power could be firm without being frantic. The Golden Age took shape not through dominance, but through endurance refined by patience. Elizabeth's legacy lay not in dramatic transformation, but in sustained equilibrium. She taught the monarchy how to last without exhausting itself. In the quiet confidence of her reign, England discovered a new tone of authority, one that did not demand constant attention, but inspired lasting loyalty. The storm had passed. What remained was a calm strong enough to carry the nation forward. By the end of the Tudor era, England no longer moved as a kingdom unsure of its place. The long road from fragmentation, conquest, civil war, and religious upheaval had reshaped the nation's inner posture. Confidence did not arrive suddenly, nor did it announce itself loudly. It settled in gradually, like warmth after a cold season. The crown, under the Tudors, had learned how to command attention without constant force, how to project stability without exhausting the land beneath it. This confidence was not arrogance, it was familiarity. England had survived enough transformation to trust its own continuity. The memory of chaos remained, but it no longer paralyzed decision-making. Instead, it informed restraint. The nation understood now that power could be lost as easily through excess as through weakness. This understanding shaped governance, culture, and identity. England's sense of self extended beyond the island. Exploration, trade, and language carried influence outward, not as conquest alone, but as presence. The kingdom began to imagine itself as enduring, not temporary. The Tudors had not eliminated danger, they had taught England how to live alongside it. Religious tension still existed, succession remained uncertain, and external rivals watched closely. Yet beneath these pressures lay a calm assurance that the nation could respond without unraveling. This assurance marked a turning point. The monarchy was no longer merely surviving history, it was shaping it. The Golden Age, so often remembered for its drama, ended not with collapse, but with quiet readiness. England stood prepared to face the next chapter, not because it expected peace, but because it trusted its capacity to endure change. As Elizabeth's reign drew to a close, the nation did not rush forward. It paused, and in that pause was maturity. The Tudors left behind more than a legacy of strong rulers. They left behind a rhythm of confidence, one that would be tested, challenged, and broken in the centuries to come, but never fully forgotten. The storm had given way to light. The noise had softened into steadiness. England was awake, aware, and ready, even as it drifted toward the next uncertainty. The kingdom could finally rest, not because danger was gone, but because it believed it could face whatever came next. There came a moment in England's long history when the crown was still spoken of, but no longer obeyed. The Stuart dynasty inherited a kingdom shaped by Tudor confidence, yet beneath that confidence lay unresolved tension. The silence Elizabeth had maintained so carefully began to fracture. Charles I ascended the throne believing in the old language of monarchy, the idea that authority flowed downward, unquestioned and indivisible. But England had changed. The people had learned to listen differently. Parliament had learned to speak. What followed was not immediate rebellion, but distance. Charles ruled as if certainty could restore order, yet certainty now provoked resistance. His belief in divine right placed the crown above negotiation, but the nation no longer accepted silence as loyalty. Disagreement grew quietly, then visibly. Taxes were questioned, authority was delayed, trust thinned. The king did not lose power in one decisive act, he lost it gradually as cooperation dissolved. Governance slowed into stalemate. Words replaced commands, and commands lost their weight. England stood in an uneasy pause, where tradition insisted on obedience, but experience demanded accountability. Charles responded by withdrawing, attempting to rule without parliament, believing absence could preserve authority. Instead, absence magnified doubt. The crown felt distant, abstract, and increasingly irrelevant to daily governance. When conflict finally surfaced, it did not arrive as chaos, but as inevitability. Civil war was not a sudden rupture, it was the release of pressure long contained. Families, regions, and institutions found themselves choosing not between good and evil, but between interpretations of order. The battlefield became an extension of debate. Loyalty fractured along ideas rather than lineage. The king remained king in title, but his kingdom no longer moved in unison. Authority echoed but did not land. The silence around the crown grew louder than any proclamation. England was discovering that power, once questioned, cannot be restored by insistence alone. The Stuart experiment revealed a truth the Tudors had delayed but not resolved. Authority depends on shared belief. When that belief fades, even a crown can become hollow. As the war progressed, the idea of kingship itself began to shift. It was no longer sacred by default, it was conditional. The nation was not rejecting monarchy outright, it was redefining it. And in that redefinition, the crown would soon fall quiet. When civil war finally spread across England, it did not announce itself with a single thunderclap. It unfolded slowly, like a long argument that could no longer remain contained. The country did not divide neatly into right and wrong, loyalty and rebellion. It fractured along quieter lines of belief, fear, and memory. Neighbors found themselves standing on opposite sides without fully understanding how the distance had grown so wide. The crown still existed, but its authority moved unevenly, accepted in one place and resisted in another. This inconsistency marked a profound change. Power was no longer centralized by tradition alone. It was negotiated, contested, and sometimes ignored. The battlefield became a space where ideas collided as much as armies. Soldiers did not fight only for a king or a parliament, they fought for an interpretation of order. As the war continued, the rituals of monarchy lost their certainty. Commands issued in the king's name no longer carried automatic weight. Parliament spoke with increasing confidence, not as a challenger seeking permission, but as a body asserting necessity. England learned to live without a single voice guiding it. The silence of consensus was replaced by the noise of debate. This noise was exhausting. Daily life continued under the shadow of uncertainty. Markets adapted, towns fortified, families waited. The war did not bring constant violence everywhere, but it brought constant tension.
The future felt suspended, held between competing visions of authority. Charles I remained at the center of this storm, not as a commanding presence, but as a symbol under strain. His image persisted, yet his influence weakened. Each defeat narrowed his options. Each negotiation revealed how far power had shifted. The crown's sacred distance collapsed into proximity. The king could be argued with, resisted, and eventually overruled. This transformation was unsettling even for those who opposed him. England was discovering that removing certainty creates vulnerability as well as freedom. The war did not resolve these contradictions, it exposed them. Authority, once dispersed, proved difficult to gather again. By the time the conflict reached its decisive moments, the question was no longer whether Charles would rule, but whether kingship itself could return unchanged. The land had spoken. It had learned its own voice, and once heard, that voice could not be silenced again. After the execution of Charles I, England entered a state it had never known before. The crown did not simply change hands, it vanished. The monarchy, which had endured conquest, civil war, and reform, now ceased to function as a source of authority. In its place stood the Commonwealth, an experiment born not from long planning, but from necessity. Oliver Cromwell emerged as the central figure of this moment, not crowned, not sanctified, but empowered by circumstance. His authority rested on victory and discipline rather than tradition. England discovered that power could exist without a king, but it also discovered how unfamiliar that condition felt. The silence left by the crown was not peaceful, it was uncertain. Cromwell ruled with conviction, believing that moral clarity could replace inherited legitimacy. Yet legitimacy proved difficult to sustain without symbols. Governance continued, laws were enforced, and order was maintained, but the nation sensed something missing. Power had shape, but not soul. The Commonwealth emphasized control, restraint, and purpose, but it struggled to inspire belonging. England obeyed, but it did not revere. The absence of monarchy removed a familiar rhythm from public life. There were no coronations, no dynastic continuity, no sacred distance. Authority became immediate, practical, and heavy. Cromwell's government sought stability through strength, yet strength without tradition felt temporary. The people endured rather than embraced this new order. Over time, the experiment revealed its limits. Without the symbolic unity of a crown, power fractured inwardly. Loyalty depended on enforcement. Consensus remained fragile. When Cromwell died, the structure he had sustained could not hold itself together. The silence that followed was telling. England did not rush to preserve the Commonwealth. It reached instead for what it had lost. The monarchy returned not as an absolute force, but as a familiar anchor. The Stuart Restoration did not erase the lessons of this interlude. England had learned that kingship was not inevitable, but it had also learned that absence carried its own cost. The crown, once restored, would never again be unquestioned. The silence of the Commonwealth lingered in memory, a reminder that power can survive without a king, but identity struggles to do so. Chapter 6 closes not with triumph or defeat, but with recognition. Authority had been interrupted, examined, and reshaped. England emerged changed, aware that even the most ancient institutions could fall silent, and that silence itself could speak volumes. Not every revolution arrives with fire and noise. Some arrive the way sleep does, gradually, almost unnoticed, until the world feels different without recalling the exact moment it changed. The Glorious Revolution was such a moment. England, weary from a century of conflict, experimentation, and interruption, no longer sought dramatic transformation. It sought assurance. The return of the monarchy after the Commonwealth had restored familiarity, but it had not restored trust. The crown was back, yet the memory of silence still lingered. Kings ruled again, but they ruled under watchful eyes. James II's reign reopened old anxieties, not because it was violent, but because it threatened to move backward. England had learned too much to return fully to unquestioned authority. Resistance formed quietly, not in rebellion, but in consensus. The nation chose adjustment over rupture. William and Mary were invited, not imposed. This invitation mattered. It signaled that power was no longer inherited without condition. Authority now required agreement. The crown accepted this shift not as defeat, but as survival. The transition unfolded with restraint. There were no sweeping purges, no public reckoning. Instead, there was alignment. Parliament spoke, not loudly, but decisively. The monarchy listened. What emerged was not the end of kingship, but its refinement. Power remained, but it learned to rest within boundaries. This was the quiet compromise. England did not reject its past, it negotiated with it. The revolution succeeded precisely because it avoided excess. By limiting violence, it preserved continuity. By defining limits, it preserved authority. The nation found stability not by silencing power, but by teaching it where to stop. This pause transformed governance. The crown became constitutional, not symbolic, not absolute, but balanced. Trust began to rebuild, slowly and deliberately. England entered a new rhythm, one shaped by dialogue rather than decree. The Glorious Revolution did not announce a new world. It adjusted the old one just enough to endure.
William and Mary did not arrive in England as conquerors. They arrived as an answer. Their rule marked a subtle but profound departure from everything that had come before. For the first time, the crown was not a singular voice claiming divine inevitability. It was a partnership, defined not only by marriage, but by agreement. This mattered deeply. The image of two monarchs ruling together reflected a new understanding of authority. Power no longer flowed in a straight line from heaven to throne to subject. It circulated. William and Mary brought military assurance and continental experience, while Mary embodied continuity and legitimacy. Together, they represented balance rather than dominance. Their reign did not demand loyalty through fear, it invited acceptance through structure. Parliament's role expanded not in defiance, but in cooperation. Laws were no longer simply issued, they were negotiated. This shift altered the emotional relationship between the people and the crown. Trust did not require silence, it required predictability. William and Mary provided this by respecting limits openly acknowledged. The monarchy remained central, but it was no longer absolute. This shared arrangement softened the memory of past extremes. England had seen what unchecked authority could do, and it had seen the uncertainty left by its absence. Now it explored a middle path. The crown learned to function within a framework, gaining durability by surrendering excess. This was not weakness, it was evolution. The nation adjusted its expectations accordingly. Loyalty became calmer, less reactive. Governance gained rhythm. Decisions arrived with explanation rather than surprise. The monarchy, once dramatic, became dependable. This dependability allowed England to breathe. Stability felt sustainable rather than forced. The Glorious Revolution's success lay in this quiet recalibration. William and Mary did not erase conflict, they contained it. They did not silence opposition, they absorbed it into process. Over time, this arrangement reshaped how power was imagined. Kings and queens were no longer distant figures above law, they were participants within it. This change did not diminish reverence, it redirected it. Respect shifted from personality to system. England learned to trust continuity over charisma. The dual crown became a symbol not of division, but of agreement. Authority had learned to share itself. After the quiet compromise had settled, England began to feel a different kind of stability. It was not the stillness of silence, nor the tension of command. It was rhythm. Parliament emerged as that rhythm, steady and persistent, shaping governance without spectacle. The crown remained visible, respected, and central, yet its movement now followed a measured pace. Decisions unfolded through process. Authority learned to explain itself. This shift did not diminish monarchy, it preserved it. By placing limits into routine, England transformed conflict into continuity. The nation no longer waited for dramatic moments to define power. Power was present every day, in debate, in law, in procedure. This everyday presence mattered. It reduced fear. It normalized governance. The memory of civil war in interruption did not vanish, but it no longer dominated imagination. The system absorbed it, turning caution into habit. Parliament's voice grew not louder, but clearer. It articulated the boundaries within which authority could operate, ensuring that no single figure would again command unchecked silence. This clarity allowed trust to deepen. Citizens learned where power lived and how it moved. Predictability replaced anxiety. The monarchy, guided by these limits, gained longevity. It could endure change without breaking. The Glorious Revolution's true achievement lay here, in permanence. The compromise was not a moment, it was a structure. England stepped into modernity not by rejecting tradition, but by anchoring it. As the century turned, the Crown and Parliament settled into partnership, each defining the other's reach. The nation rested in this balance. It did not guarantee peace, but it made peace imaginable. Authority, once dramatic, became dependable, and in that dependability, England prepared for the next evolution, one that would expand influence outward while keeping power at home contained. The quiet heart continued to beat.
After centuries of struggle, transformation, collapse, and return, England arrived at a quieter understanding of power. The crown still existed, but it no longer needed to prove itself. The Hanoverian era did not begin with conquest or rebellion. It began with acceptance. Authority had learned its limits, and within those limits, it found longevity. The Act of Union in 1707 marked more than a political arrangement. It represented a shift in identity. England and Scotland did not merge through force, but through calculation shaped by exhaustion. Conflict had taught both kingdoms the cost of division. Union promised endurance. The crown became the symbol of that promise, not as a ruler over competing lands, but as a steady presence binding them together. This new Great Britain did not demand devotion through spectacle, it offered continuity. The monarchy's role softened. It moved from command to representation, from directive to emblem. Power lived increasingly in institutions, while the crown learned the art of remaining visible without intervening. This restraint was deliberate. It reflected lessons hard-earned over generations. The Hanoverians ruled in a world where authority was shared, negotiated, and limited. They did not need to dominate history, they needed to outlast it. England's story had taught that survival mattered more than triumph. The crown endured because it adapted, it listened, it stepped back when necessary. This adaptation allowed Britain to expand outward, not through internal strain, but through confidence rooted in stability. Trade, industry, and governance grew within a framework that no longer depended on royal assertion. The monarchy remained, not as the engine of power, but as its anchor. The nation moved forward quietly, assured by the presence of something familiar that no longer demanded attention. The Hanoverian crown did not shine brighter, it burned longer. And in that steady glow, modern Britain took shape.
As Britain moved further into the modern age, the monarchy discovered a quieter purpose. It no longer stood at the center of decision-making, yet it never disappeared. Instead, it became something subtler, and in many ways stronger. The crown transformed into a symbol that held memory, continuity, and reassurance. While Parliament debated, governments rose and fell, and society reshaped itself through industry and empire, the monarchy remained steady in the background. This steadiness mattered. It offered the nation a sense of time that moved slower than politics. The Hanoverian kings and queens understood that survival depended on restraint. They learned to appear without dominating, to speak without commanding, to exist without interfering. This balance allowed the monarchy to pass through reform, revolution abroad, and rapid social change at home without fracture. The crown absorbed meaning rather than impose it. It reflected the nation back to itself, reminding people that while governments change, identity can endure. Ceremonies replaced decrees, presence replaced power. The monarchy became a living archive of the past, carried forward into each new generation. This role did not demand attention, it rewarded calm. In moments of uncertainty, the crown's continuity reassured rather than directed. Britain's strength increasingly came from institutions, laws, and civic life, yet the monarchy gave those systems a human outline. It became the quiet face of a long story. This evolution was not accidental. It was learned through centuries of trial. Authority had discovered that influence lasts longer when it does not insist on being felt. By the time Britain stood fully within the modern world, the monarchy no longer needed to prove relevance. Its endurance was proof enough. The monarchy remained because it had learned when to be silent, and in that silence, it continued to belong. After everything England had endured, the crown no longer needed to move. It simply remained. Wars had reshaped it, revolutions had tested it, silence had nearly erased it, and compromise had preserved it. What survived was not an instrument of command, but a presence. The monarchy became part of the landscape of time, like an old road still guiding travelers even when new paths appeared beside it. Modern Britain emerged without ceremony. It formed quietly, through habits rather than declarations. The crown stood as a reminder that endurance is not loud, it does not rush, it waits. Through centuries, the meaning of monarchy shifted again and again, yet its role narrowed into something precise. It became continuity itself. In a world that changes quickly, something ancient remaining still offers comfort. This comfort is not about power, it is about memory. The crown holds the weight of countless lives lived beneath it, generations that passed through fear, hope, struggle, and rest. It connects the present to a long, unbroken line of experience. That connection reassures. Britain learned that strength does not always come from asserting control. Sometimes it comes from letting go. By stepping back, the monarchy stepped into permanence. It no longer needed to shape the future directly. The future moved on its own, guided by institutions, people, and ideas. The crown watched quietly, marking time rather than directing it. This quiet presence allowed the nation to sleep, metaphorically and literally. Stability settled in. The long story of kings and queens softened into a background rhythm, and in that rhythm, modern Britain found peace. The crown endured not because it demanded loyalty, but because it offered something rarer, familiarity without force. As the night deepens, the story slows. The crown rests, England rests, and history, having traveled far, finally breathes.